Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Gretchen Crosby Sims. I'm the executive director here at the Institute of Politics. We're very pleased today to welcome Dr. Arthur Brooks to campus for a conversation on his new book, Love Your Enemies: How Decent People Can Save America from the Culture of Contempt. Fabulous. The book is for sale in the hall, and Mr. Brooks will be signing those after the program. I want to give a special thank you to Matt Lewis, our moderator, who is returning to campus after serving last spring as an IOP Pritzker Fellow. I also want to mention a couple of upcoming events. Next Monday, we're going to have a panel of former speechwriters for Presidents Obama, Bush, Clinton, and Reagan, who will be discussing their time at the White House. On April 18th, we're going to have former White House senior advisor Valerie Jarrett in conversation with David Axelrod, doing a live recording of the Axe Files podcast. You can find out more about these and other upcoming events at our website at politics.uchicago.edu. We will, as usual, have questions after the conversation. There will be a microphone that will be just over there. And we, as usual, give priority for the first 3 questions to students. And we remind you, I probably don't need to remind you, but a question does end in a question mark. Please put your phones on silent. And here to formally introduce our speaker is Cedric Camacho. Cedric is a first year from Palm Springs studying economics. He's a member of the College Republicans here on campus. And I'd like you to help me welcome him to the podium.
Thank you all for attending this afternoon's event. The IOP is delighted to welcome Dr. Arthur C. Brooks and Matt Lewis to the University of Chicago and to today's discussion. Nearing the end of his professional music career as a French horn player, Dr. Brooks sought a degree in economics, which he attained from Thomas Edison State College. He then continued to acquire both a master's degree in economics from Florida Atlantic University and a PhD and MPhil degree in policy analysis from Frederick S. Pardee Rand Graduate School soon after. Succeeding his continued academic career at Rand, Dr. Brooks began working on material which intellectually pursued an understanding of relations between culture, economics, and politics. He's a New York Times bestselling author who has written 11 books. In addition to his political writing, Dr. Brooks has been president of the American Enterprise Institute, a conservative think tank, since 2009. His defined goal for the AEI is to provide conservative intellectual movement that helps us understand how culture and policy can be propelled forward. Along with advocacy for limited government and fair capitalism, under Brooks' presidency, the institution has also amplified its role in studying poverty, particularly on methods to overcome it. Today, he will be joined by Matt Lewis, senior columnist at the Daily Beast and political commentator at CNN. His work as both political writer and pundit has earned him praise as both a rising star of politics, according to Politics Magazine, and Blogger of the Year by the American Conservative Union. Last spring, he was a Pritzker Fellow here at the IOP. Together, they will discuss Brooks' recently published book, Love Your Enemies: How Decent People Can Save America from the Culture of Contempt, and lay out his vision for American political culture. Please join me in welcoming Matt Lewis and Dr. Arthur C. Brooks.
Thanks, Cedric. Thanks for that really gracious introduction. Thank you to the IOP and to all my friends here at the University of Chicago. See Mark Sanford, my old friend, who's a fellow here for 8 weeks, and Matt Lewis, whom I've known for 13 years. It's funny how far back he was in junior high in those days. I'm delighted to be here and a great opportunity to be here talking about this new book that I've got. And you know, when Cedric, he introduced me, he talked about the efforts that I've made to make a better conservative movement. I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm not going to try to convince you of anything that I believe politically. What I want to do is create a movement not of conservatives, but of people who want to bring the country together and who are sick of how polarized we become. And I want you to actually stay with your political views. I mean, a lot of times I might come here and think that, give you some ideas that I think that might persuade you that my free market ideas might be a good way to achieve some of your objectives, but that's not my goal today. My goal today is to have you join me in trying to lift up the country and bring people together. I'm going to try to do that in the next 15 minutes, and then Matt and I are going to have a conversation about how we can turn this into action on all of our parts. If I do my job today, over the next half hour, 45 minutes, you're going to go empowered and ready to be the beginning of a new movement that will make the country better, that will make you happier, and that will make you more persuasive no matter what your politics are. Big goals. Now, the project that I'm on, it actually started a number of years ago. You know, when you're trying to solve an old problem, you don't solve it by thinking harder in an old way. You need an epiphany. And so what you need to do is to go cruising for new ways to think about old problems. That's how entrepreneurs think. And I'm not telling you anything you don't know. This is a great university. You'll learn this, not just by muscling through the old way, but looking for an illuminating moment. And I had an illuminating moment about American politics 5 years ago this April. Okay, so 5 years ago this month. I was starting to become pretty alarmed about sort of the freight train of polarization and political hatred that appeared to be coming down the tracks, the way that politicians were talking about American politics, where it's either my way or no way. That's not how anybody would ever do business. You know, trying to do a business deal in any capitalist system, you actually want the other side, when you're doing a deal, to get something. Because that's ethical, that's decent, and it also leads to more deals. But in politics, you get this zero-sum mentality in times of tremendous political polarization. And I saw indications of this. I had read this article early, like in January or February of 2014, that really captured my imagination. I'm an academic, I'm a behavioral social scientist, so I read that literature. My day job is raising $50 million a year and doing 175 speeches. That's my day job, right? So my job is like running for the Senate and never getting elected. But you know, at night, I go home and I do what I've always done, which is always kind of as a college professor, I read the literature. And I read this article real early in 2014 that kind of made my hair stand on end. Like, that's a joke. Anyway, and it was in the American Journal of Political Science. And it was a guy named Adam Waits who teaches at Northwestern University, and he was writing about something called motive attribution asymmetry. What's that? That's when you have two sides in a conflict, and both sides are completely convinced that they are motivated by love, but the other side is motivated by hatred. Now, when that happens, you can't have any reconciliation, you can't have any compromise, you can only have political polarization. When are you most likely to see it? In cases of conflict, even armed conflict. You see it in the Balkans, you see that in the Rwandan genocide, you see that in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You see motive attribution asymmetry is very common in those situations. Okay, now the reason that this study caught my attention is because this guy, Adam Waits from Northwestern, he found data showing that for the first time since we've been taking these survey data, that Democrats and Republicans in America have the same level of motive attribution asymmetry as the Israelis and Palestinians. That's a big problem. What that means, now, when both sides think that they're motivated by love and the other side is motivated by hatred, both sides can't be right. Both sides can be wrong, but both sides can't be right. And the biggest problem, as I stated before, is you can't get compromise, you can't make progress. Okay, so this is really on my mind. You know, I read an academic study like this, and it's just like, you know, got me boiling. Most ordinary humans would, you know, not be, you know, emotionally motivated by this academic journal article, but me for sure. So, and I'm thinking about this, and I'm going on the road a lot. I'm doing what I always do, which is going to different places and speaking. I speak to all different kinds of audiences. It's a great thing. I have the best career in the world. I talk to very progressive audiences, sometimes on college campuses and middle-of-the-road non-political groups, chambers of commerce, et cetera, and a lot of very conservative activist groups as well. And it was in this last category in April of 2014 when I found myself in New Hampshire talking to 700 conservative activists, okay? Like super fired up conservative activists, three-cornered hats, the whole deal. Okay, I got there a little early and I was looking at the program and I noticed that there were 15 speakers and I was the only one not running for president. Which, you know, there's a lot of people running for president or saying they were going to run for president in 2014. But it was like, you know, Ted Cruz and Scott Walker and Donald Trump and me. I'm like, huh, how did I get on here? That's a mistake, obviously. But there's no mistakes in life. So I thought to myself, what am I supposed to do here? What is the divine intention, as it were? What can I do to make this situation a little better? So I listened for about 45 minutes before I started. It was like 15-minute talks, and they were all doing what presidential candidates always do. You get in front of a super sympathetic audience, and you say, you're right, and the people who aren't here are stupid and evil. Right? You trash the other side that's not even present. That's what you do in rallies if you want to get people to support you politically. I mean, God bless them. I don't have to run for president. I can run for anything. I don't have to get elected. I never have to get a vote. So it's easy for me to say. But it is noteworthy that that's the modus operandi of people who want to be elected to public office, particularly President of the United States. So I was looking at that and I thought to myself, what can I do to make this better? I had this motive, attribution, asymmetry paper in my mind, and I got up in front of the audience and I said, I was giving a talk about economic policy, and it was, you know, my own particular political ideology is center right, so I was saying a lot of things that they agreed with. But then I stopped and I said, you know, I know that you agree with the things that I'm telling you, but I want you to think for a minute about the people who don't agree with the things that I'm saying, and they're not here. They're not here because they're not welcome, right? These are political progressives. And I want you to just remember right now that they're not stupid and they're not evil. They're simply Americans who disagree with us on public policy. And if you think you're right and you think I'm right, then your job is to persuade them with love. It was not an applause line. The applause line came a few seconds later because this lady says, I think they're stupid and evil. And she got all the applause. That was very unfair, I thought, but that's not my point. Here's the epiphany. Here's the insight that came, right, that inflected my thinking, that helped me understand that motive, attribution, asymmetry paper. What popped into my head at that moment was Seattle. Why? Because it's my hometown. I grew up in the most progressive city in America. My mother was an artist and my father was a college professor. What do you think their politics were? I'm the black sheep of the family. You know, I'm the one who thought differently. Let me tell you something about my parents. They weren't stupid and they weren't evil. They were great parents who prepared me for life and cared about my education and wanted me to think for myself, even though they disagreed with me. And I tell you something else. My parents died a long time ago. But I can tell you with a high degree of statistical certainty that they were right on a lot of things that I'm wrong on. I don't know what yet. I get the rest of my life to figure that one out. It was, and here's the point. That lady, she was making a joke at that New Hampshire rally. No big deal. She wasn't trying to hurt my feelings. But she was insulting my mom. And I took it personally at that moment. And this is the insight. This was what squared the circle for me about motive, attribution, and symmetry. It reminded me of something, a great lesson that my father taught me when I was a kid about moral courage. Okay, now, you learn a lot to speak truth to power. You learn this a lot on college campuses today. And that's correct as far as it goes. But speaking truth to power does not require moral courage. It might require courage, but not moral courage. Moral courage does not entail standing up to people with whom you disagree. Moral courage entails standing up to people with whom you agree on behalf of those with whom you disagree. That's what people who are truly morally courageous do. They say, I may agree with you, but don't talk about them that way, particularly when they aren't present. That's hard to do. And that's exactly what we don't do in America today. And until we do that, we're going to have a motive, attribution, and symmetry problem, which means we're going to have a polarization problem, which means we're going to have a populism problem, which means we're not going to bring the country together. That's the problem we need to solve. And the book that I wrote, that I'm talking about today, was born that day. Now, you got to first diagnose the key issue. You know, what is actually creating this motive attribution? Why would it that I would think that I love and that you hate? Why is that? I asked a lot of people in the run-up to this. I asked a communications expert, social psychologist. I'm a behavioral social scientist myself, but I asked people who are more sophisticated than me in the relations between people. One of the people that I asked was a guy named John Gottman. He's the world's leading expert on marital reconciliation. The guy's a hero. I mean, he brings couples together, right? That's a great thing to do. He protects love. In his laboratory, University of Washington in Seattle, he has the Gottman Marriage Laboratory. He's brought thousands of couples that were on their way to divorce back together again. And John Gottman says, he told me that he can talk to a couple for just a few minutes who he's never met, but who are quarreling, who are in his laboratory. They didn't have problems, they wouldn't be there. And he can predict with 94% accuracy if they will be divorced within 3 years. You probably want to know what he's looking for. Me too. He's not looking for anger. Why not? Because anger is uncorrelated with separation and divorce. Anger is a hot emotion that says, I care what you think, and I want to change what you think. It means I care about you. I'm married to a Spaniard, and the secret to my 28-year marriage is the lack of correlation between anger and divorce. So what is correlated with divorce? It's when you take anger and you mix in disgust, and it takes a hot emotion and turns it cold. Contempt is the conviction of the utter worthlessness of another person. That's a definition given by Arthur Schopenhauer in 1860. It's the conviction of the utter worthlessness of another person. Even if you don't feel that another person is worthless, if you treat another person as being worthless and what they say as being useless and being beneath anything that you would care about, you will make a permanent enemy, according to John Gottman. Back to the married couples. What is he looking for that signals divorce? Eye rolling. That's actually how we talk to each other in politics today, right? Eye rolling, sarcasm, derision, dismissal, to say that is the stupidest thing I have ever heard. Not, I disagree with you. Not, I want to hear what you've got to say. Not, I think your facts might be wrong. Not, you know, I understand morally why you care about that. I've got a better way to achieve your goals. No, no, no. That is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. That's how we talk to each other. That will break up your marriage, and that will create mode of attribution asymmetry across a culture. That will take people who are not trying to kill each other, but people who disagree with each other, and turn them into enemies. Contempt is the enemy of America. It's the enemy of a unified America. It's the enemy that we have to unite against, is contempt in our communication. This book is my manual for you to stop expressing contempt. Are you expressing contempt? Probably. Probably, because we all do. You know, I was doing research for this. I was going through old clips on YouTube. I saw myself roll my eyes on CNN. I was debating some lady, you know. She was wrong, I was right, so I thought. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe she was right, I don't know. And you know, I thought she got her facts wrong, and I rolled my eyes. And you know what I bet she didn't do? I bet she didn't go home from that debate, and I bet she didn't say to somebody in her house, you know, I was on TV with this guy who's the president of the American Enterprise Institute, and he was making some very good points. She did not say that. I guarantee she went home and said, what a jerk. And she was right. I was a jerk. I didn't mean to be. I did not hold her in contempt. I just treated her with contempt. Because that's how we've learned to communicate. That's how our politicians have taught us to treat each other. That's how the media have taught us to treat each other. That's how the entertainment industry, that's how too much of academia has taught us to treat each other. If you disagree with somebody, that person is making you unsafe. Therefore, you need a safe space and a trigger warning. Therefore, you should treat that person with contempt. That is ruining our country, and it's time for us to fight back. When I say us, what do I mean? 93% of Americans hate how divided we become as a country. 93%. That means 7% don't hate how divided we become as a country. That, my friends, that's the outrage industrial complex. That's the politicians and the elite media and the entertainment industry and the academics who are getting rich and powerful and famous and getting followers and getting friends and getting satisfaction and just having fun by telling people that they should hate each other. The rest of us don't like it. The rest of us, we're not making a living at it. We just have a habit of doing it. We need to stand up to the people that are ginning up all of the hatred in our country, and we need to break the habit ourselves. This book is about how you can break the habit. For all of my career, I've been an institutionalist. You know, social scientist. I'm an economist. And so what do? You say, you got a problem? You need a government program. You need better politicians. You need a better business community. You know, you need a new philosophy, something like that that'll come from above, right? That's not right. If you really want to change something, the problem like we've got in America, you need an interior revolution, and it needs to start with you. And here's the good news, the best news of the day that has changed my life. You can be the beginning of the social movement that rejects contempt. You don't have to change your politics one iota. If you think you're right, go for it. Hammer and tongs, because this is a country based on disagreement, also known as the competition of ideas. You can reject all the junk that you're being sold about how we need to be civil to each other and tolerant. Civility and tolerance, garbage standards. If I told you that my wife and I are civil to each other, you'd say, you need counseling, right? Tolerance, garbage standard. If I told you my employees at the American Enterprise Institute tolerate me, you'd say, you have a morale problem. We need a higher standard, which we can attain if we have this interior revolution. And if you do it, here's my promise. You will become more persuasive. Remember, nobody in history has ever been insulted into agreement. It has never happened. You will be more persuasive if you treat people without contempt and with more love. You will be happier. I've got the facts on how it will change your brain chemistry. It will change your heart and quite possibly the hearts of other people. And you will be one small part in the rebellion against the outrage industrial complex that is holding this country down. You have literally everything to gain and nothing to lose. That's my offer to you. How are we going to do it? Well, I get to bring in my old friend Matt Lewis to help us figure out how to do it together. And then I get to listen to your questions and have the thoughts that are on your mind. But at the very beginning, I just want to close my opening remarks by saying to write this book has truly changed the course of my career. To talk about it has given me greater satisfaction than anything I've ever done. And if you weren't here, I wouldn't be able to talk about the University of Chicago. So my last words before I sit down are thank you.
All right. Well, that was great. I'd like to hear, I'll sit back and let you talk more, Arthur. That was pretty inspiring stuff. You mentioned, I know you've previously written a whole book about happiness.
Right.
And this book, if we follow it, if we stop the industrial outrage complex, will make us happy. But talk about that, because I do think that when I'm on Twitter, I find myself becoming angry and demoralized. How can we manage it? And then maybe give us the reason. Like, how can we be happier by doing this?
So to begin with, you mentioned the contempt engine of social media, which is Twitter. Some of you are on Twitter, some of you are not. Those of you who are not, congratulations. Those of you who are, you need to manage it differently for your own self-defense. So I actually have a lot of work in this book that I've done on the use of social media. And social media is a complicated thing. I'm writing my Washington Post column about it for the week after next, actually, about how the literature is starting to form that very clearly shows that relationships that we have that substitute for real relationships, virtual relationships are counterfeit for real relationships, and that's the reason that social media use is directly proportional to loneliness, depression, anxiety, and now some people think even suicide. Dangerous stuff. You have to protect yourself. And that means to protect yourself, you have to do a number of things to make sure that you only ever use it as a complement to your life and never as a substitute. The more that it substitutes for your actual interactions, the more bitter you'll become, the more unhappy you'll become, the more lonely and isolated you will become. As sure as Matt and I are sitting here, I can guarantee you that that's the case. Those of you who are not on social media, you find this sort of weird and head-scratching. Well, that's because you haven't fallen into this pit. A lot of people my age have. The most astonishing thing to me as an academic has been to see people who are really distinguished academics from some of the greatest universities in America, from the University of Chicago, Princeton, Harvard, who used to write books and articles. And now they post to Twitter 40 and 50 times a day. The brain chemistry behind this is very simple. When you post to Twitter, and you look at the notifications, the responses that you get to it, you get little bursts of the neurotransmitter dopamine. There's a lot of work that's going into this. This is the same thing that you get when you light up a cigarette. The same thing that you get when you satisfy any urge or any habit. Habits are all processed by a part of the brain called the nucleus accumbens, very ancient part of the brain that bypasses your prefrontal cortex. And when you're satisfying these rewards, the reason that you're reinforcing this mechanism inside your brain is because the neurotransmitter dopamine, which gives you tremendous pleasure, is stimulated a little bit. Going to Twitter and seeing what somebody said about your photo, your comment, your derisive, snarky remark about the President of the United States, whatever it happens to be, is simply satisfying a minor addiction. It's like smoking a cigarette. Don't do it, is the bottom line. Break the addiction. Don't be a slave to that, is the bottom line. Getting away from it as much as possible is very, very important.
I would say that it's an occupational hazard
Yeah.
for what I do. I don't think I can get away from
Yeah.
it and keep my job, sadly. Let's talk about habits, right? So
But wait a second, you can have it not ruin your life.
Yeah.
Is the key thing too. I mean, there's a lot of things that you could do. I mean, you could be a spokesman for, Seagram's, and that doesn't mean you have to be an alcoholic. There's a lot of things that you could do that could be abused and that you don't have to abuse. It just means that you are in greater danger than a lot of people.
Well, I think setting up, first of all, realizing the danger.
Yeah.
And then setting up filters, ways to keep it from overtaking you. And so, for example, using the mute function.
Yeah.
And maybe setting like a time limit. I'm not going to go on Twitter after a certain hour. These are, you talked about habits. Like, these are habits. And I'm intrigued by that because I really believe that people don't so much decide who they're going to be as they decide their habits, and the habits decide who they're going to be. But how do habits fit into this?
So you just basically restated Aristotle. As of course you know.
Great minds think alike, of course. I did my dissertation on that, but please, for those who are not familiar.
So, I mean, the whole idea that habits make the person. I mean, this comes from, the virtues become habits, and habits actually form who you are. That's an incredibly Aristotelian protocol for how to build your life. And of course, it's true, but you don't want to actually have to think about the virtuous things that you do, the ways that you lift people up and bring them together, that you satisfy the dictates of human dignity. You want to have these things be really, really automatic. And so I talk about this an awful lot. And again, this gets back to the habit of expressing contempt. Contempt really is like smoking. It gives you a tiny little reward. You roll your eyes and say, that's the stupidest thing you've ever heard. It gives you a little bit of a reward because you feel right. Sometimes you actually get affirmation from people around you. In college classes today, it's very easy to insult a particular point of view and have people kind of applaud you. That feeds your nucleus accumbens, and it becomes an automatic protocol in your life. That actually leads to the contempt that will ultimately make you unhappier, make the world unhappier, drive people apart. So how do you break that habit or any habit? If I'm talking about breaking habits, I have to talk to you about the brain science of habit breaking. It's reprogramming the nucleus accumbens. It's funny, when people do things that they don't like, and they behave in a particular way, they communicate in a suboptimal manner, or just engage in any behavior that's not productive, willpower doesn't do the trick. I won't smoke, you will smoke. What you need to do is every time you feel stimulus, you have to choose response. Okay, the way that you reprogram the nucleus accumbens, the way that you change your habits, in the case of this book, The Habit of Treating Other People with Contempt, is you do two things. Number one is, the Buddhist masters always talk about you're stimulated by something, which means you have a cognitive response. You're conscious of wanting to do something. Buddhist masters always talk about the gap between stimulus and response and maximizing it. You get stimulated by something, you don't react. Not reacting, very Buddhist, right? Your mother was a Buddhist master. How do I know that? Because she said when you're angry, count to 10. Same idea, okay? So number one is expanding the space between being stimulated. When you want to express contempt, when you want to say something is stupid, you want to roll your eyes, whatever, usually you've been stimulated because somebody else expressed contempt to you. The natural response is contempt for contempt. So what do you do in response? Now, I was working on this. I was working on this research project. I was thinking, what's the optimal response to contempt? And at the time I was making this movie, and I think we're showing this movie called The Pursuit. It's coming out. We're showing it here at the University of Chicago. It's a documentary, full-length documentary film about happiness. And we're looking all over the world for these secrets to happiness. It was an incredible project. It'll be it's in screenings and then film festivals, then it'll be on Netflix. So if you're interested in this, it's coming out now. And I was shooting this film. At the very end of the film, I was in the Himalayan foothills. I was in a little town called Dharamsala in northern India. And if that name sounds familiar, it's because that's the home of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Now, I've been doing work with the Dalai Lama very intensively for the past 7 years. It's a kind of a weird collaboration. The president of the American Enterprise Institute and His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the world's leading Tibetan Buddhist. I love him. I mean, he's taught me so much. He's a mentor and a friend to me, and always given me the best advice. And I've written with him, and I've interviewed him many times. And while we were making this movie, between takes, at the end of this movie, I was thinking about this contempt problem. I said, Your Holiness, what should I do when I feel contempt? And he said, practice warm-heartedness. And I thought, you got anything else?
Because, that just sounds kind of weak. It sounds like an aphorism or, it's like, ugh. But then I thought about it. And, the Dalai Lama, as some of you know, is the world's most respected religious figure. He's not my religion, but he's the world's most respected religious figure. How did he become that? He was kicked out of his homeland when he was 24 years old and led his people into exile. Pacifists, poor, a tiny minority, rolled across by an aggressive militaristic force to be forgotten, to be disappeared. Because that's always what naked aggression does, is it disappears the weak. And over the next 60 years, he became the world's most respected religious figure. I'm on stage at the University of Chicago talking about somebody I would never know about under ordinary circumstances. How is that? And the answer is he answered contempt with warm-heartedness for 60 years. That's the source of his power. That is pure power. Look, you can be the slave to your emotions. You can have the response be automatic to stimulus. You're treated with contempt, you answer with contempt. Or you can be a strong person. You can be the master of your own emotions, which means maximizing the gap and putting, as the Dalai Lama calls it, warm-heartedness, which you can also just call love, in that space instead. That doesn't mean agreement, because you don't have to agree. You shouldn't agree. Certainly doesn't mean civility and tolerance. It means actually respect and warm-heartedness and love for other people. And in so doing, you can get a little bit of what the Dalai Lama has done, the power that you can get. And that's how I have tried to change my life. And I'm telling you, things have gone better for me since I had that conversation.
I know you're a fan, or at least have read the Stephen Covey's books, like 7 or 8 habits?
7 habits of highly effective people.
Yeah. And so one of the things in the Covey book he talks about, someone went to Covey and said, I don't love my wife anymore. Like, I don't have the feeling. It just, and what should I do? And he said, act like you love her, like pretend.
Yeah.
And so when you talk about putting in place the Dalai Lama's advice, at first it's almost like fake it till you make it,
yeah.
Which sounds phony, but it turns out there's social science to support.
Yeah.
If you want to behave a certain way, start behaving that way, and eventually your taste will change.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's the most amazing thing. Because I did ask him that. I said, well, Your Holiness, what if I don't feel warm-hearted? He said, fake it. The Dalai Lama told me to fake it. And I'm like, that sounds so wrong, but it's not. There's a huge amount of brain science and social science to back up the fact that attitude follows action, not vice versa. Or not just vice versa. It's incredible that attitude follows action. So if you want to feel more gratitude, because gratitude, that's pure pleasure. If you want to feel more gratitude, actually express heartfelt thanks. Or try to get as close to the heartfelt as you possibly can. There's this wonderful body of research that talks about smiling and happiness. This is my main area. This is the stuff I read at night. But there was a guy, a French physiologist in the end of the 19th century named Duchenne. And Duchenne, his whole beat was mapping the human smile. He wanted to know if the smile was cultural or if it was physiological. And so he traveled all over the world, Papua New Guinea, and he was all over India and Japan and Switzerland and every place else to see if human smiles were the same. Turns out there are 19 human smiles in every culture, and only one of them is associated with true human happiness. Okay? Now, you want to know which one it is, right? He got it named after himself. I mean, academia is so awesome. I mean, he probably still didn't get tenure. Anyway, so it's the Duchenne smile. It's for authentic human happiness. And here's how it works. It doesn't have anything to do with your mouth. It has everything to do with your orbicularis oculi muscles in the corner of your eyes. When you scrunch up your eyes and you get crow's feet, that's the happiness smile. And we have 1 million cognitive ways of ascertaining if somebody's actually happy to see you. And they really all focus in on the corner of the eyes. When you're 80, you should have crow's feet, because that means you've had a happy life. You've been happy over and over and over and over again. That should be your goal when you're 80, is to have pronounced crow's feet, because that means good things have happened to you in your life. Okay, so why do I bring this up? Because later, 100 years later in the 1990s, University of Michigan, there were studies that were asking if I could simulate the Duchenne smile by exercising manually the orbicularis oculi muscles, whether I would actually run the causality in the other direction and get more happiness. And sure enough, what they do is they take people and they put a pencil in their mouth lengthwise and hold it really tight, and that manually scrunches up the orbicularis oculi muscles, and people get happier for an hour after they do it. And it's because you fooled your brain. This is power for you. You want to be something, you got to act that way. And that's, once again, that's the central insight, behavioral insight of Aristotle. You know, this is how different from, you know, the Platonic ideal. The Aristotelian ideal is be who you want to be, and that's who you'll become.
Now, there may be people out here listening to us talk, listening to you talk, saying, well, that's nice, but you have to understand that the people that I'm arguing with are calling me a racist, calling me a misogynist, or
They are racists or misogynists.
Or they are, right? Or they want to destroy the environment, and guess what? This is an existential threat. Why should I be nice to those people?
Right. So I've heard this a lot, and you know, over the past 3 weeks that this book has been out, I've done 50 television and radio interviews. So I've heard a lot of questions, and a lot of times people will really say that. What if the person really is evil? I mean, because there are evil people, right? Isn't it my responsibility to call them out as evil? Isn't it that my responsibility? Now, I'm not talking in this book about existential threats of warfare, actual World War II Nazis. People are at your door firing rockets into your neighborhood. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about Americans with Americans. This is the freest, most prosperous country in the history of the world. It's appropriate to be grateful in the United States because there's no knock in the night and jackbooted thug for what we believe. And under those circumstances, I always have to ask, if somebody's truly evil, shouldn't I call them out as evil? I say, okay, well, get that person in your mind, okay? And if you're on the right, it's one person. If you're on the left, it's somebody else. Get that person in your mind. Okay, what is your objective? Is your objective to exile that person and kick them out of America? Well, no. Is your objective to arrest that person and put them in jail for their views? Of course not. Is your objective to sneak into their house and hurt them while they sleep? Absolutely not. What do you think I am? What is your objective? To make them think differently. Well, how's that hate working out for you? Have you ever persuaded anybody with hatred? Ever in your life? Has anybody ever been persuaded? Can you say, you're stupid and evil, and somebody will go, you got a point. It has never happened. If your objective is to persuade, you must use love. There is no other way. And that means, by the way, that in the United States, where we're largely talking about ideological differences, even though they're bitter ideological differences, I mean, really strong, that you must separate the ideology from the person. You can say, I think that's deeply misguided. I completely disagree. That's an evil way of thinking, even though I don't think you're an evil person. Or at least I'm not willing to commit to saying that you're an evil person. I hold out hope for you, even though I dislike the way that you think. You have no other remedy if your ultimate goal is not to kill, but rather to convince.
So I'll preface it by saying I agree with you, but I want to push back a little bit, because there is, I would say especially on the left, there is a sense that some of the problems we have, say for example structural racism, they have to do with issues of justice.
Right.
And some of the people aren't going to be persuaded. They don't even realize that this is going on. But they need to be shamed. They need to be shaken. We need to take to the streets. Maybe a little violence, some people would say, actually would be the spark to get people to change their minds. How do you answer that?
They're wrong. And there was the most beautiful sermon based on Matthew 25:44 by Dr. Martin Luther King in 1963. Matthew 5:44, love your enemies. I know it pretty well because that's the title of my book. So I didn't, it's like funny when I'm doing a lot of, secular, really, really super secular media, and people will say, well, that's a really clever title. Like, yeah, nothing new under the sun. So Martin Luther King was giving a sermon on Matthew 5:44. He said, Jesus said, love your enemies. He didn't say like your enemies. He didn't say agree with your enemies. Like, as he said, and Martin Luther King said, just it's impossible. He was such an incredible preacher. He said, like is a sentimental something. Love isn't. Love is hard. Love is what we're commanded to do. If you really want to change the world, there is only one way, and that is love. So if you're all about virtue signaling and you're all about scratching the itch of your addiction, okay, then you can say, I'm going to call people out, I'm going to shame them, I'm going to say that they're evil, I'm going to banish them, maybe even use a little bit of violence. And there have been people who've always said that. But if you believe that Martin Luther King was right on this, and he went to his grave not knowing if he was right. Only 33% of Americans agreed with Martin Luther King on the day of his assassination, as far as we can tell from public opinion polling. Today, 95%. He won. He was right. And he was preaching a revolution of the heart, an interior revolution of each person to live up to his or her own values. He was preaching a revolution of each person's treating other people with love, even those who were wrong and that we didn't like. That was his explicit understanding. He said, and by the way, this came from Abraham Lincoln too. Abraham Lincoln said, "I destroy my enemies when I make them my friends." What he meant by that was not that I do my enemies harm, but by loving my enemies, by making them my friends, I destroyed the illusion that that person was my enemy in the first place. That is super profound. That is pure power. That the idea of implacable conflict, of all or nothing, of hatred toward those with whom I disagree, that's the strategy, that is a weak strategy and ultimately an ineffective strategy.
I want to talk about some of what I think are perverse incentives out there today and the structural problems that we need to overcome to get to your vision. And I'll give you a couple of examples that your talk reminded me of. One, I've seen this, tell me if you've seen this lately. There's people arguing on TV, and that's been around for a while, but now when people are arguing, one person will start filing their nails or checking Twitter, which is worse than eye rolling, I would argue, complete contempt. That person often will actually be rewarded by being featured on Mediaite or being tweeted, becoming a meme. So perverse incentives. The other thing that you reminded me of is talking about moral courage. I mean, John McCain at a town hall event told somebody in his audience, corrected them. You know, the woman said that President Obama was, or then Senator Obama was a Muslim, and McCain was like, "No, ma'am, no, ma'am." John McCain lost. Now, I'm not saying that's why he lost, but when I've brought that up before and kind of praised McCain for his action, it's been pointed out to me that he lost. The incentives, I think, are not great right now. Now, I know you're preaching this, this thing where each of us, we can change hearts one at a time. Is there anything we can do collectively, though, to change the system? Yeah,
so 1 in 6 Americans have stopped talking to a family member because of politics since the 2016 election. That's catastrophic for happiness. Almost 1 in 5, it's more than 1 in 6. I mean, love is the nuclear fuel of happiness. And when we've stopped talking to close friends and family members because of politics, that's as they say in baseball, an unforced error. Okay? That's also a source of power. 93% of us hate how divided we become as a country. That is a latent, untapped source of political power. What happens is when you can create a movement, and this has happened many times in the past. Ordinarily, by the way, if you look historically at periods of populism in America, populism comes almost always on the heels of a financial crisis. Financial crises happen twice a century. They happen because of a tremendous asset bubble, and the follow-on effect of financial crises is asymmetric economic growth. I'm being an economist now, so forgive me. Asymmetric economic growth does not mean that we have low growth. It means that growth is not shared equally across the different quintiles in the economic or the income distribution. Ordinarily, for 10 years after an economic crisis, after a financial crisis, virtually all of the fruits of economic growth go to the top 20% of the income distribution. It's a very interesting paper that was published in the early part of 2017 by 3 economists at the University of Berlin in the European Economic Review that shows in the 10 years after a financial crisis, across 800 elections and over 120 years in 20 advanced economies, we have the causal impact from a financial crisis over the next decade of a 30% bump in the voter share for populist parties and politicians, and their message is always the same. Somebody's got your stuff, and I'm going to get it back. Now, if they're on the left, it's bankers and the 1% and rich people, and if it's on the right, it's typically immigrants and foreigners or whatever. But it's always the same. Somebody's got your stuff, and I'm going to get it back. That's rewarded for a while, but then it fails. And it usually fails ugly in America. You know, this is not France, where the status quo is, you know, what do you think of Bill Gates? I don't know, let's burn his house down and take his stuff. It is the United States, where what do you think of Bill Gates? I don't know, I hope my kid is the next Bill Gates. This is a very hopeful country, right? This is not an envious nation. That is not we have our own national pathologies. I'm not being anti-French or xenophobic or you know, rah, rah, rah. We have our own problems here, right? But for Pete's sake, This is not the natural status, cultural status quo for the United States, what we're in today. This is not. This is going to end, and this is going to end ugly for populists. I don't know when, because it can go. I mean, it can be like William Jennings Bryan, 1896, 1900.
6 times? How many times did he run?
Well, he was the candidate a bunch of times. He was the candidate 3 times.
The nominee.
The nominee.
The Democratic nominee.
The Democratic nominee, and he was only neutralized by being absorbed by the progressives into the Democratic administration of Woodrow Wilson. That took a long time. That was agony for this country with that kind of populism. It can go a long time, but it does end, and it ends ugly for the populists. What does it turn into? That's up to us. Look, do you want the 93% to win? Do you want love to win? Do you want unity to win? Do you want to lift people up and bring them together? Do you want to have a competition of ideas? You want to disagree in a way where you realize that most Americans have very common moral objectives. We are not opposed, orthogonal to each other morally to a very, very large extent. Is that what you want? Then we got to go out and get it, is the bottom line. We need to together reject the pugilistic, populist, polarization. I'm starting to sound like, all my words start with P. And we need to do that. Basically, what I'm saying in this book is that we can and we should do that together. Look, my generation has screwed it up. Those of you who are in school today, you can fight back.
So you and I did this, I don't want to like the fourth wall or whatever, but we did this 3-4 weeks ago. And at the time, I was basically saying, well, but the evidence is that it's not working. It's like William Jennings Bryan all over again, right? It's like this Donald Trump, and then you've got like the people trying to be the liberal version of Donald Trump and like out-Trump Trump on the left. But since that time, something interesting has happened, for Pete's sake. His name is Pete Buttigieg, has kind of caught fire. This fresh-faced young mayor who is, I mean, he seems to have tapped into something a little different, and he's being like almost the opposite of Trump. I don't want to get out over our skis here, but are you seeing something maybe in Mayor Pete that is a message of your book?
I don't think he's read it. He might have. He might have, for all I know. It's one of the great things when a book is actually selling. You never know who's going to read it. Yeah, I actually do see that. And I do see that, particularly in state and local politics in both parties. Federal politics is really problematic because it's reality show. It's the entertainment industry. And the really alarming thing is that people are mostly affected by state and local politics and state and local policy, and they don't know what's going on. I was in my hometown talking to somebody I really love and I'm really close to right after the 2016 election. Somebody was super wrapped around the axle about the election of Donald Trump. And I said, who was elected to be the superintendent of the school board on the same day? It's like, I don't know. That matters for Seattle. Seattle is as far away from Washington, D.C. as the planet Neptune. I mean, it's just like the federal government doesn't affect Seattle very much on a practical level most days. But the superintendent of public schools, that's a big deal. And nobody knows who the person is. That person could be a nut. Seattle probably is. Anyway, and like, my goodness, that's what we need to start paying attention to is the people who are actually affecting us. And what I see, all kinds of good things coming. And at the state and local level, I see Democrats and Republicans who don't want this reality show, who don't like the circus. I mean, you and I live in D.C., and so this is kind of a lot of what we talk about. But this is not the way it has to be. So I see some early stirrings among national candidates that are trying to do this too. I mean, Beto O'Rourke is actually trying to kind of fight back against this a little bit, and Pete Buttigieg is trying to fight back.
I would think it's an opportunity, like a niche that's almost unoccupied.
I know, and I saw this thing that was really, it's kind of capturing my imagination. I just saw it yesterday, as a matter of fact. So, the Trumpian, backlash, it would be, the new socialism among in the House of Representatives, right? I was, AEI, my institution, we partner with the Kennedy School, the Harvard Kennedy School, for the new members of Congress. Right, and this was an interesting thing because I'm actually leaving AEI on June 30th, and on July 1st I'll be a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School. This is my new institution. I'm becoming academic again. And so I was there kind of representing both institutions, and I was talking to all of the new members. I was given a talk, similar to the themes that we're talking about here. And some of them weren't there because they were out protesting the Harvard event. Because Harvard, and they weren't protesting AEI because we're irredeemable, but they were protesting Harvard, saying that Harvard is too conservative and too corporate. And I'm like, I'm not even here yet, man. Anyway, so, and it was an amazing thing. I thought, this is kind of a populist backlash to what has happened in the Republican Party, but the Democratic Party, super contemptuous, take no prisoners. The other side is really, really stupid and evil. And of course, there's the spokeswoman for that is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from New York City. But yesterday I was watching, and somebody asked her, you know, about, why don't you go ahead and say, I can't remember the question, go ahead and say that the other side is just evil. And she said, I won't say that because I don't believe that. I thought, huh, that's progress. I mean, credit where credit is due. Look, you can have somebody, I disagree with 157% of her policies, but if she's willing to actually just go hammer and tongs and not be doing what I saw going on when I was at Harvard, not with those, you know, the pugilism of going out in front and protesting, you know, inferring motives, saying that everybody inside is a sellout, and changing the tack, if she's going to do that, man, that's progress on the horizon. I'll take it all day long.
Yeah, I think we're going to take some questions, so if you have a question, please line up. Let me ask you a quick one while people do that. Talk about this 5-to-1 rule. That's something I think we could immediately apply to ourselves with Twitter.
Yeah, so John Gottman, the psychologist that I talked about a little bit earlier, he has this, when couples are on their way to divorce court, one of the things that you see is they can't think of anything but criticisms of each other. And when couples are first in love, they can't think of any criticisms of each other. This is the main characteristic in the dynamics of a relationship is criticism. All criticism or no criticism, it depends on where you are. You know, the wonderful beginning or the catastrophic end. And so what he makes them do to repair that, he turns back the clock manually. And the way that he does that is you have to carry around notebooks. And when you want to criticize your partner, you actually have to say 5 beautiful, loving things first. And you got to write them down. And you can't get to the criticism until you've got through the 5 things. So it's just, and it's brutally difficult. So he'll say, you know, he'll be like, yeah, I can't believe she picked me up late again. I'm going to lay into her for that. It's always the same with her, right? You can tell what's on my mind because I told you my wife is Spanish, right? So, and so, but you have to make a list of 5 things. And so it'll be like, you know, I think it was incredibly thoughtful of you that, you knew I was coming home late and you made me dinner. You know, I really appreciate that. And, God, you look so great today. And I love your mother. Forget that one. And you know, you got to get through 5. And if by the time it turns out that John Gottman finds that by the time you get through 5, you can't get to the 6th because you've forgotten. And that changes relationships. That substitutes contempt with love. Manually. Why? Because actually what's in our hearts is love, and that's what we really want. That's what we really wanted all along. That's what gives us our heart's desire. Okay, so I asked John Gottman, who's on my podcast, and I said, John, how do I apply that to politics? And weirdly, the super famous guy had never been asked this question before. It's like, huh, wow. Well, you could do that on social media. You should do that on social media. Where if you want to criticize somebody or say something snarky or sarcastic, fine, but you got to write it down. And before you do that, you got to send out 5 loving, affirming, positive messages first. You got to say, you know, on a 5 positive Twitter messages saying, good point, to somebody you disagree with. What a beautiful day to be alive. Okay? And by the time you're like, oh man, because this really changes your Twitter persona. Most people on Twitter are not the people that they actually are. Most of us are, you know, we're pretty nice to each other. We're pretty civilized. You know, you would never say things to people in ordinary life that you would say to each other on social media, cloaked either by real anonymity or virtual anonymity of having somebody not look into your face. Twitter is like Washington, D.C. traffic, you know, where people are encased in automobiles and you can't see their face, and so they're terrible to each other. So what are you going to do? You basically, the way that you change people's driving behavior is you make them manually go out and do nice things for people in traffic. That's how you do it, by the way. I mean, that's actually how people are counseled to do it. Do the same thing on Twitter. By the way, in traffic in D.C., where we live and suffer, the best way to do that, to take away the anonymity, I'm convinced, is to put a bumper sticker on your car with your name and your house of worship.
Matt Lewis, Columbia Baptist.
That's right. Now, I just got flipped off by Matt Lewis from Our Lady of Sorrows. Unlikely, right? Unlikely. So, but the 5-to-1 rule is really interesting because you can practice that. If you have a lot of contempt in your life, you have a lot of contempt in your relationships, the way to change yourself manually is to put the 5-to-1 rule in place in your life. And by the way, it really will help your marriage too.
Let's do some questions.
Hi, my name's Yang. So it might be wrong, but it's from my observation. There seems to be a Faustian bargain that as young people get more politically informed, they tend to have more ideological coherence and then tend to have the persona to argue for argument's sake. So for young people, how to balance the need for absorbing information of what's going on in the world by reading quick piece on Twitter or OPADs, and the need for the immunity from the influence from the outrage industrial complex.
How do you balance that? Now, one of the things that I recommend to young people, my own students, for example, is that when you have to be very careful where you get your information. Because algorithmically, all of the influences on us are designed to make sure that we're not getting balanced points of view. Literally, if you're getting any of your news from Facebook, you're being brainwashed and you're being used and manipulated, and somebody's making money from it. If you get your information from social media, somebody's making money on you, right? Don't be used. In the 60s, talk about stand up to the man, right? And so you choose where you get your news. Now, by the way, that's not even easy. You know, for the newspaper that I write for, when you read a news story in the opinion section, depending on what you just read, you will be fed something next that's a little bit more outrageous, but that agrees with you based on what you just read. Now, you might fool it by reading things that you disagree with, but probably not. So if you read a story that says Trump is corrupt, the next story that's fed to you is that Trump is evil. Trump is irredeemable. The world is ending. The zombies are coming. You know, it's one after the other. It takes you up to 11 increasingly. So one of the things that I recommend to young people is that you have to stop being used by not letting people curate your news sources, which is increasingly an easy thing to do. And in so doing, at very least, as they're learning the techniques of argumentation, they'll get a balanced diet, not all hot carbs in their own ideological direction. Thank you for that. Thank you, sir.
Although your message is generally in favor of tolerance, I wonder whether there's a salutary intolerance for deliberate falsehoods, and perhaps to be exercised more against your supposed political allies as well as your ideological opponents. But how would taking offense at being lied to be deployed and related to your message?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And somebody pointed out in an early talk that I was doing for this book that I was expressing contempt for the outrage industrial complex. That was a good point.
Catch-22.
It is a catch-22, except this, and this is the point that I think a very adroit point that's embedded in your question. You should call out falsehoods. You should say things that are untrue, if they're untrue. You should disagree. But you should separate what somebody says from the person. It's, we all have, a lot of us, those who are students know, but the rest of us, we have teenage kids, and which is really hard. And the key mistake that people make when they have teenage kids, there are a lot of mistakes that people make with teenage kids, but one of the key things is not separating bad behavior from the kid, right? And to say, you didn't study hard enough and that's why you got a D is different than you're a terrible student. Right? Attributing something to the person is inherently unconstructive, but actually disagreeing with what somebody does or what somebody says or even what somebody thinks, that can be incredibly constructive. And indeed, you will have a fighting chance of actually being persuasive if you can make that key separation. Stay in the fight. If something's a lie, say, I think that that's not true, but never say, you're a liar, because that's unconstructive. Look, that's a judgment call that probably is beyond your pay grade. That is to say, you're lying all the time. You don't know that. In very few cases do you know that. The main reason that we have today, the New York Times is a running file of ways that President Trump is a liar. That's actually unhelpful in a lot of ways if they actually want to persuade people on the other side as opposed to simply getting readers and simply scratching the itch and simply virtue signaling. That's the reason that we have this oppositionality so much between the press and the current administration. It's going to be oppositional because, thank God, I want the press to always be oppositional to sitting politicians. I think that's a good thing. But at the same time, I want people to follow the direction that you have just indirectly given me and given us, which is to separate people from their ideas and to not make a conflation of those two. Thank you for that.
Michael Chevalier, the Divinity School. First, being married to a Puerto Rican, I appreciate the marriage advice today. You have sort of hit across, or we've in our conversation, three different relations, right? A relation to ourselves and a concern for our own happiness, our face-to-face relation that we have with other people, and then what I think is actually the majority of our relationships these days, which are these relations at a distance, whether it's sending a tweet, our Facebook, our appeal to federal politics. And I'm wondering, what I'm hearing right now is that we need to try and repersonalize some of these relations of distance. But I think it'd be great to go back to the question that was brought up earlier about trying to incentivize or change the structures such that we can try and root out some of this contempt from people who, you know, are eye-rolling at a distance, right? And who we can't feel the sort of their humanity, right?
Yeah.
We can't feel that face that's presented before us.
Yeah, that's right. So, and we're really talking about social media at this point. That's actually what we're talking about primarily.
But even federal politics, right?
It's
The fact
true.
that none of us think about our, except for the fact that we had an election here yesterday where the majority of Chicagoans didn't actually vote in it, right? But that we still have an appeal just to our federal political situation and not our local political situation.
Things that are far away is
Right.
okay. Now for the first part of the answer of that is becoming more local, is actually being fully alive where you are. I mean, it's fully alive in your life, fully alive in your family, fully alive in your community, right? You will, 100% guaranteed, you will be happier if you do that. To the extent that you're living far away from yourself, you're alienating yourself. But here's a different tack on this whole thing. There's one of the great founders of the field that we know today now as social psychology was from a French psychologist named Gustave Le Bon. He wrote his seminal book in 1895 called The Crowd, which was basically the psychology of large groups of people. Psychologists never do this stuff anymore. It's really anachronistic, but it's a wonderful book because what he talks about is anonymity. That's the key thing in there is anonymity. The problem that we have in society today is that anonymity dehumanizes. When I make somebody else anonymous, I dehumanize that person. Worse, when I am anonymous myself, I've dehumanized myself. I've taken away my own humanity. Now, what's the first thing that Le Bon said? He says that people become inherently intellectually and morally weak when he calls it de-individuation. So, and he had no concept in 1895 what anonymity was going to look like in the era of the internet. Right? We have a lot of new studies that shows that sociopathy is maximized, that sociopathic characteristics are maximized when people are in anonymous fora, and that true sociopaths are the ones who most like to have trolls. There's a great study by 3 Canadian social psychologists last year called Trolls Just Like to Have Fun. And it was about that you can actually test for sociopathic behavior, asking people if they like to comment anonymously on news articles. Because usually the fourth comment is racist and vile. That's basically people having fun. And those are the dark underbelly of the outrage industrial complex. Okay, how do you fight back? How do you personally fight back against that? And be happier and be more constructive. Number one, commit never to being anonymous ever. Never be anonymous. And I can't, it's like, I have a lot of libertarian friends, and they're like freaking out when I say that. It's like, yes, but Madison, and it's like, Twitter is not the Federalist Papers. I'm sorry. All right. Commit never to being anonymous. In 1958, you write a letter to the editor of the paper, and it was like, Jim Smith on Elm Street. Right? You got your own little op-ed, right? Sign your work, okay? Number two, never interact with anybody anonymous ever. No interactions. That's really hard for you and me, right? Because we have public presence on social media. We have, I don't know, you and I have like 50, 60, 70,000 Twitter followers and 150 or 200,000 Facebook whatever, right? That means that we're getting input from people who are actually anonymous, and we build our platform sometimes by interacting with people. But you gotta make a commitment. If somebody is not willing to sign their work, they have dehumanized themselves. Love only happens between humans. Love doesn't happen between one human and one Russian Twitter bot. love doesn't happen between one three-dimensional person with a heart and one-dimensional person who's an avatar on Twitter. It just doesn't work that way. So that's my self-defense strategy for you, is no anonymity on your side and no contact with anonymity on the other side. And it's really, really hard to do. Can you feedback on this? Can you push back on this?
No. Don't feed the trolls. Don't respond to Bernie Bro 2020 or Trump Mania 2020.
Yeah.
I think we have time for 2 more questions.
Yeah. I think we've got 3, so we'll do. Oh, you're right. Okay, sorry. 2. Yeah, thanks.
Hi, Arthur. Adam Sylvain. I work in alumni relations with the university.
Thanks.
Also a New Hampshire native, and just want to apologize that this message wasn't better received in my home state. But,
no, it's all good, man.
Really
It's
I'm really drawn to the practicals of what you shared, social media, and some of what we shared in the last question, and particularly, you mentioned your parents who you are opposed to politically, and I think one of the challenges that I face is more the point of, I like the distinction you made about moral courage. And in my own family, I tend to agree with a lot of my immediate family, at least politically, but I find that I would really like to change their attitude in regards to contempt and the way that they sort of package and articulate those views. Any practical advice in terms of, again, keeping it close to home, starting with ourselves, within our own families, how we can start to build better habits in this area? Yeah,
so in the book I talk a lot about this because, this is an intensely personal book insofar as that it's not, for the first time I've written a book not about how to change others, but how to change me. And this is a book about how I'm trying to change me. Right, and it's not a memoir because God knows nobody will ever need a memoir from me. But it is a map to my own heart, and I write it with real affection and I hope generosity toward other people to change themselves. But here's the good news about writing something about changing yourself: you become winsome and magnetic when you do that. The best way for you to spread the good news is to reflect the good news. It's the best way to do it. You can be a spy. You need to go undercover. And the way that you go undercover in any situation is by blending in and then behaving in a particular way that will flip people. Be a counterintelligence agent for love. And the way that you do that is at your Thanksgiving table, right? And basically, when you do this, you lose Twitter followers because people find you less interesting because you're not scratching their need for dopamine. You're actually giving them less of the neurotransmitter that they seek by going on the platform in the first place. But people will see that and they'll say, geez, man, there's a change in that guy. There's something about it. I want some of that. And you'll attract a different kind of people, and you'll attract people in a different way. You want to be persuasive, model the behavior that you like to seek, that you're seeking in the first. And some people will actually seek you out and ask what you're doing, and a lot of people will just find themselves behaving better. That's why it starts with you and me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, 1 more question.
Yeah, I'm Jean Jenkins from the neighborhood. And I hear you about this love. I'm a member of various organizations, including Alcoholics Anonymous, that preaches that you will be happier if you don't have resentment. So
right.
I understand all this, but and I'm kind of a flaming progressive, so I don't know if I'm in enemy territory here or not, but...
You're in the University of Chicago, you're not.
I know.
You're in friendly territory.
Everything is in the University of Chicago. And I think I've managed to get myself into politically a silo with all my friends and all my family, and everyone agrees. And while I have I don't really have much of a problem with people I come face to face with, even people I don't agree with. But my problem is all these people that are over there, where? Rural Ohio or something, wherever, that I think are evil and stupid, and I don't know how to go about, getting love to people I don't see, that I just think bad of their opinions.
Yeah.
And I realize this is not a behavior to be commended.
Yeah, no, I understand. Yeah. I understand, and thank you. And I'm the same way. I'm a sinner. I've done all the bad things I'm talking. Look, I wouldn't have had to written the book if this weren't a problem for me, right? And I have a public job, and so it's especially important that I not goof this thing up. One of the things that I talk about is how to get out of your silo even when it's hard. And I don't actually recommend trying to find new internet communities where you can do that. Oh, that's not a bad thing to do, but that's not necessarily what I recommend. I recommend going farther afield in the people that you would actually talk to. And that's, that used to be much easier because we were far more integrated communities back in the old days. I bet when you and I were kids, there was Democrats and Republicans, and there were people who thought all different ways, and people of different religions and all that, and your parents or your family members, and now we're surrounded. I mean, we go to a house of worship where people agree with us. We send our kids to a university that has a monolithic ideology. They're even, by the way, that's not just left wing. You can go to a university where everybody's right wing now. You can just make sure that you're never threatened, that you're never unsafe by hearing things. And that means that it takes a lot more work. I've had to do that with my own kids, is sort of try to get my kids. And it's funny, I'm super free range kind of parent. And my kids now, they're thinking for themselves in this very alarming way. I got one kid, and he's a junior at Princeton University, and he's very critical of President Trump. He's very critical of President Trump. And I have one kid who didn't go to college, and he's a farmer in Idaho. He's a wheat farmer in Idaho. And he calls me up, and he says, "Dad, you want to know why we love Trump?" And I said, "No, son, tell me." And he said, "Because he fights for people like me." And I said, "You mean like affluent kids from Bethesda?" And the bottom line is that the reason that we have diversity because we've sent them out to the antipodes a little bit, and so we need to do that too. You and I need to do that too. You and I need to make more friends in new places where we haven't met them before, and that means sometimes we need to travel. Sometimes we need to make a bigger effort to do it than we've done, and then listen with love, and then look for the moral commonality. And when we do that, boy, it can be really, really powerful. There are more organizations that are dedicated to it, but there aren't enough. And so you and I have to kind of take it on ourselves and build it. Thank you for that.
Thank you for everyone who came. Check out the book. It's called Love Your Enemies. And round of applause for Arthur Brooks.
And for Matt Lewis.
Thank you.